Good afternoon, everybody. Let me welcome you to the Stone Chapel at Lanier Theological Library. But as director of the library, my name is Charles Mickey. I get to welcome you and introduce our moderator, Jim Hoffmeyer. Jim is a distinguished professor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's called the Professor of Old Testament and Ancient Near Eastern History and Archaeology. He has numerous books to his credit, articles galore. Jim, come and then introduce the other panelists.
Thank you, Charles. I'd like to add my welcome to all of you for being here. This is a great occasion. Let me introduce the panel. Our focus this afternoon will really be dealing with early Christianity in the Middle East, of course. That's where it all began. And some of you think the Bible Belt means this is where it began. But no, that's not the case. It really did begin miles away from here. And there's so much about early Christianity we here in the West do not understand, do not appreciate, and do not realize how much we really are connected. Our roots go back 2,000 years. And so we want to get at some of that today. And so there are a number of experts here with us, and all of them have actually worked on excavations at sites revealing some of the early Christian architecture. So we're going to talk about some of those things this afternoon. And so let me introduce the panelists one by one. And we'll start first with Dr. Tom Davis, who has been here before, participated in other occasions. Tom is a archaeologist, has worked with me in Sinai, now is directing excavations in Cyprus at a late Roman Christian era site. So we'll probably hear a little bit about what Christianity looked like in Cyprus. After all, Paul went there, didn't he, and Barnabas. And Tom is a professor of archaeology at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I'd like to introduce next Dr. Charles Stewart, who is a local from University of St. Thomas here in Houston. And he is an art historian by training, PhD from Indiana University. And he specializes especially in Byzantine and medieval Christian architecture and art. Our distinguished, we're using that word. I was going to say, Charles, that was very nice of you referring to me as distinguished, but I've never had one of those distinguished titles. I thought, I went to my dean and I said, I'm thinking of retiring, and I thought maybe they'd come back and say, well, we'll make you a distinguished this. And you know what they said? He says, great, when do you want to retire? Anyway, this is Darlene Brooks Hedstrom. She is chair of the history department at Wittenberg College in Ohio. I have the pleasure of saying that she was a student of mine at Wheaton College many years ago, and she's done very well in the age department. She looks younger now than she did then. But that's time in the desert. That great hot desert sand on your skin is really good for you. But we're glad she's going to be the keynote speaker tomorrow night, so I hope you're planning to be here for that. And lastly on our panel today, Dr. Magid Mikhail. Magid is a professor of history at the University of California at Fullerton, did his PhD at UCLA. Now, if you're from my neck of the woods, UCLA is the very distinguished way we refer to the university closest to Lambert Avenue, which is the local junior college. But anyway, he's at the one in California. So, these are our panelists today, and they do bring various expertises to us. Some of them are working in very different worlds. Tom and Charles work more in the Greek world. Darlene and Magid work more in the African and Egyptian world. So some of the fun we'll have is sort of how these two worlds interface in the same time periods. Something else that Egypt gave the Christian world is monasticism. If you know any monks, their spiritual ancestors came from Egypt. So Darlene and Magid have spent time actually working in that world, discovering it, exposing it. What's behind monasticism? Tell us about Anthony and this whole movement and why it's significant and so on.
Okay. Well, that's a question that scholars ask all the time. So there's not an easy answer to that, but there are many answers, and they're all very interesting stories. So, of course, on the cynical side, there's the idea that there were all these Christians who decided to run away from paying their taxes. I don't know if anyone's felt like that during tax season, but I don't think that's really why people would stay in the desert for 40 years at a time, is just to avoid taxes. But that was one of the theories for a very long time. Another theory is that individuals that did this became mad, that Christians kind of lost their minds. And that had held sway for a long time because of our perception, I would say, as the scholarly world, about why people would live on the fringe, which is where a lot of these monastic communities were found. And yet, more studies, and in particular, what I have worked on recently, is calling into question that idea, so that St. Anthony is somebody who is not really the first father, although he gets the title of the first father, because his story was written about by a bishop from Alexandria. Athanasius writes this story about him. And there's lots of complications about why a bishop is telling the life story of this monk who is living by himself, and sort of his cult of personality, that people want to be near him and they want to benefit from him, and why Anthony then becomes such an important figure. But if you look at how Athanasius tells the story, Anthony actually seeks out another monk. He seeks out some other man who has started to live on the fringe of a property by himself. And so the monastic movement, when we look at it sort of with a broader historical lens, is one in which we see trends of Christians asking themselves, how do I live? How do I follow God in a world in which I can no longer offer myself for martyrdom? How do I show my devotion to God? And how do I separate myself from the noise of my family, or the noise of the obligation to have to get married or have to have children? Can I have a life where I live alone, just in devotion to God? And then this becomes a very popular choice because it allows for individuals, both men and women, to live in communities with their own gender, and to pursue their passion for God with other like-minded people. And in order to do that, you have to live in a new place. You have to sometimes separate yourself. You have to run away from your family sometimes. We have stories of monks, both men and women, running away, and their family members desperately hunting them down at monasteries, saying, is my child hanging out here? And so there was a real kind of passion for some of these things. But it was also a space in which you could pursue your intellectual life. So monasticism attracted both the very poor and the very wealthy, and everybody in between. And so there's a longevity to that attraction that's not just in Egypt, but it sort of develops in the Eastern Mediterranean sort of simultaneously.
Please add to that, Magid, what you like, but I would also like you to, in addition, to tell us a little bit about, is monasticism alive and well in Egypt today? Is it still functioning?
Well, to continue with what Dar started off, I mean, it's definitely a phenomenon in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the evidence for Egypt and Syria is neck and neck. Palestine comes in a little bit later. And scholars do argue that, Anthony wasn't the first, but it's clear that even among that first generation, Anthony does cast a very long shadow. In general, I think it's important to view monasticism as both something old and something new. One of the things that is often overlooked, especially kind of in contemporary Christianity, is that early Christianity does have a very strong ascetic streak. All-night vigils, remaining celibate for an individual's whole life, fasting for long periods of time. These are not things that were invented per se for Christian monasticism. These were things that can be traced much, much earlier. What is unique with Christian monasticism and what Anthony kind of gets credit for, rightly or wrongly, is kind of combining this with this notion of retreat also, that you are kind of now being segregated to some extent from the world, which oftentimes is actually much more ideological than actual. A lot of monasteries are clearly in contact with the nearby villages, with nearby fields and the like. We mentioned Shinuti, the 5th century monastic figure, a little bit earlier, and Shinuti, every Sunday, he would have the villagers coming and hearing his sermons after the liturgy. There is something, once you kind of get into this notion that your Christianity has these aspects already existing there, and not to get overly romantic, but there is something about the simplicity of simply working and praying and offering one's whole being to God. I mean, even the monks, not all of them lived up to all of the great expectations, but even their work, the way they kind of perceived work was important as a means to an end. I mean, it fulfills the biblical prophecy, St. Paul, whoever doesn't work should not eat. But in providing for themselves, especially in the Egyptian context, it was front and center that what they earn, they provide for themselves, so they are not a burden to anybody, but also that a significant portion of that, anywhere from 2/3 to at least a half, is given away to charity. And one of the ideas behind work is that how am I going to provide for widows and orphans if I don't have an income? I need to work in order to be able to give charity. And the merging of work and prayer together, so that there is a simplicity there that, and again, the notion of offering all of this voluntarily to God as a personal sacrifice. There is something to it. As far as today, definitely in Egypt, there's been a monastic revival since the 1960s. The numbers, I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but in many cases they're almost tenfold, where you have monasteries that had 3 or 4 old monks now having 80 or 90 monks. The largest ones tend to be those in Wadi Natrun, which is kind of ancient Sketis, right in the heart of the delta, I guess.
It's between Alexandria and Cairo in the desert, yeah.
And you have, the writing of the late Pope Shenouda, who was patriarch for well over 40 years, popularized the ideal. But also the writings of Father Metta Meskin, Matthew the Poor, who is may not be kind of a known commodity to in the West, but those that are kind of into monastic studies and current monastic spirituality. Father Matthew the Poor is one of the main monastic authors, and you can kind of see the fruit, if you will, of a monk who's been working his whole life simply reading the scriptures and kind of immersing himself in the patristic heritage. But currently, yeah, the number of monks in Egypt is perhaps one of the largest, maybe even before the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So one thing I would add to this too is Megan mentioned that this is not in some ways necessarily a new way of living. And that's true when we look at the form of asceticism that was being practiced by the Neoplatonists in Alexandria, and especially when we look at athletes within the Greco-Roman world, that some of the same terms that are used to describe those who are following philosophical lives are the same terms that are used to talk about monks in terms of how do they practice, how do they control their body. The Stoics have very similar habits in terms of how do they eat, how do they sleep, how do they have feelings or not have feelings. So the way of living has very concrete parallels to earlier communities that set themselves apart. And so when we think about, was monasticism kind of a new idea for those who were not practicing it, I'm not sure it would have been as new as it is to us as modern readers, where we're not seeing that kind of disciplined lifestyle as much around us. that monasticism may in fact have been a very natural thing to develop within the Christian community because of those parallels.
The only thing I would add is that within a Christian context, however, all of these ideas, even the ones that are coming from Greco-Roman philosophy, were always Christianized. I mean, even when you look at the Stoic philosophers and kind of the ultimate aim of being without any passion, without any need. Within monastic literature, it always came up just short of that. You have an account with John the Little, where John keeps on praying, God, take away all my temptations, take away all my passions, and he is said to have been granted that gift, and then he goes out, he comes back to the cell, and he was sharing the cell with his brother, in this case an actual monastic brother and a blood brother. He had an older brother, and his older brother wouldn't open to him, and he tell him, why aren't you opening? It's me, it's John. And his brother told him, no, I don't recognize you. God, I think you should go and pray to God to return the passions to you, because how else are you going to make progress in this world? How else are you going to be tested and proven? Those who are beyond temptation are the angels, and if you aren't an angel, you no longer live here.
Anything about monasticism from your world?
Yeah,
or
I would just add to this is it's important to keep in mind that when you read the New Testament, it talks about the family of God. That when you become a Christian, you have your natural family, but when you become a Christian, you become part of a supernatural family. And Jesus talked to God the Father as Abba. Well, in these monastic communities that arise, the head of the monastery in Egypt would be called Abu, and in the West he would become an abbot, and the nuns would become sisters and mothers, and the brothers and fathers. This kind of familial language starts to develop within these communities. So monasticism, in a way, is a new kind of family. It's a Christian family. It's about working together for the common good of the community. And in a sense, if any of you belong to a church, your community, your congregation, is a kind of a monastic community where you're all helping each other become better Christians. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And another important idea here is that these communities were predicated on the idea that they believed the end time would be soon, and they needed to group together and protect each other from persecution as well. And so to separate yourself from the world was also in a way of protecting yourself from your spiritual and physical enemies as well.
Anything from you, Tom, on this subject?
On Cyprus, you don't really see the monastic space happening until the Middle Ages. It's actually when the church comes under threat of first Islamic domination with the Arab raids and Arab conquest in the 7th century. And then from the Greek perspective, when the Latin Crusaders come, do you see the flourishing of the monasteries up in the mountains? They pull out of the cities, the Orthodox Church, and go into the mountains. And that becomes the salvation space for Christianity and for Greek culture. So it should be no surprise to us that the first president of independent Cyprus is a monk, Archbishop Mikhail.
Interesting. Yeah.